when he talks about law, good law and bad law. Okay. He also takes a stand. He is in jail at the time as a result of being arrested for the demonstrations in Birmingham in the spring, late winter, early spring of 1963. And many commentators have remarked on it. It's the most common speech of his or statement, not just because it wasn't a speech, it's a statement of his in most books. It's been reprinted more so than I Have a Dream speech that he gives on in Washington at the March on Washington in 1963. The other one I like is of course, is the one that Preska, Ms. Tolan or Dr. Tolan mentioned, uh, that speaks to his challenge to America and his challenge to African Americans and his challenge to Euro Americans who supported him. Some years ago, I had a chance to meet and talk with King's attorney, and he clarified some matters for me. When King and before King made that public statement at Riverside Church that Sunday, uh, his closest associates, Ralph David Abernathy, Andrew Young, they all warned him, don't do this. You shouldn't do this. You're going to lose the support of Lyndon Johnson. And certainly in King's passing and death, others would say, oh, I was with him and I supported him. Maybe in their hearts, in their minds, they knew he was doing the right thing and supported him, but they did not take the stand with him. And he was essentially pilloried in the liberal press, certainly in the conservative press as well. But he found good company among the students who had a moment of, again, disaffection with him as well. And another friend, Vincent Harding, has written a great deal about that. So I think certainly that speech and the one dealing with voting and voting rights, because he said that was number one. That's a major issue. The right to vote should be in this country the number one freedom. And I'll say something here. I think, well, it'll be tied into what I say in my introduction to Reverend Lawson. But let me give you some idea about Alabama and the right to vote, because so much has come up with this in this recent fall elections. The social conditions of African Americans in the rural South were horrendous, and life in the Black Belt counties of Alabama were especially deplorable. Black people made up approximately 47% of Alabama's population on record. It had been higher than that, but they had no political power. Over 80% of the eligible African Americans were not registered voters. Dallas County, the origin of white citizens councils and the stronghold of the Ku Klux Klan, the birthplace of Eugene Bull Connor, the sheriff up in Birmingham, had an unenviable reputation for its use of terror and violence against Black people. The four adjacent counties, Lowndes, Wilcox, Autauga, and Perry, had a Black population of 87,972 and a white population of 47,289. However, only 904 Black people were registered voters in comparison to the 24,037 white people. In Wilcox and Lowndes counties, out of a population of over 14,000, not one Black person was registered. Although Black people made up 57% of the voting age population in Dallas County, barely 1% of them were registered voters. Selma was the town of approximately 13,000 white people and 16,000 Black people, but the town had less than 2% of the population was registered, Black registered voters. The U.S. Commission on Civil Rights was routinely rebuffed when it sought information to explain this gross inequity, and the Justice Department found the matter to be the hardest to litigate. Selma's white population, and I'll stop shortly after this, made it clear that African Americans were to have no involvement in political affairs. And to the extent that a few Black registrants would be begrudgingly tolerated, their numbers were so minuscule as to be of no consequence. Segregationists believed that voting privileges implied equality between Blacks and white people, and this was a situation that would not be tolerated. Numerous barriers were erected to stop Black people from registering to vote that included intimidation, Economic reprisals, coercion, and assault and battery. Most common were various types of qualification tests, administrative procedures, literacy tests were common, but the passing was rarely a simple matter of reading the writing. In Selma, the voter registration office opened only for a few hours, 2 days of a month. One's registration form could be disqualified if applicant could not recite from memory verbatim portions of the Alabama or U.S. constitutions. Now, if you've ever seen the Alabama Constitution, Mississippi, it runs over 200 pages. It's extraordinary. Anyway, if these measures prove insufficient to prohibit a registration, the judges might just arbitrarily deny an applicant a passing grade, or on occasion use physical force, violence to stop Black persons from registering. Given the pace at which Dallas County officials were taking to register Black voters, it was estimated by the Justice Department that would take over 100 years before all the eligible Black people could vote just in that county. I'll stop there, but it comes to mind because in my U.S. history, of course, as some of you know, I teach the Reconstruction period, which is getting more play these days. And Harper's Magazine and some of the prints, the lithographs from it have been reprinted. And you see a Black fellow going to vote with a gun in his head. I've just read you this section of this that happens certainly in my lifetime. But it's not just Alabama, it's Mississippi. You could find it in Arkansas and elsewhere as well. But to see today, when the Republican Party is moved again, once again, to try to restrict voting, to try to limit the time to vote, to move registration offices and so forth. We seem to be going through this again. Now, this is what brings me to introduce our next speaker. And this is the venerable Reverend Dr. James Lawson. He's pastor emeritus of Holman United Methodist Church here in Los Angeles. Certainly, it's with great pleasure and profound respect and gratitude that I welcome and introduce Reverend James Lawson, the primary guest speaker at this African American History Month program. Born in 1928, Dr. Lawson attended Baldwin Wallace and Oberlin colleges in Ohio. Later, he attended Vanderbilt University's Divinity School in Nashville, Tennessee. His life spans the most critical decades, I should say, of the civil rights movement. As a young pacifist, he went to prison rather than kill others in the Korean War. He studied the practices of Mohandas K. Gandhi, embraced the ideas of Howard Thurman, and traveled to India years before Dr. King. While many historians of the civil rights movement are aware of his major role in organizing students such as Diane Nash, Bernard Lafayette, and the late John Lewis and others in the Nashville desegregation campaign, starting in February 14th, I think it was kicked off, 1960. Few of them are aware of the fact that Reverend Lawson had been teaching students the techniques of nonviolence direct action for many years before the four heroic Black freshmen at North Carolina A&T inaugurated the first sit-in movement in February 1st of 1960. The sit-in movement caught on like wildfire. It is estimated that over 70,000 people had challenged institutions to desegregate in over 150 cities by the end of 1960. After that triggering event in North Carolina, but certainly what Reverend Lawson had done in getting students from Tennessee State and Meharry Medical College, Fisk University, to march as well. Most importantly, this is just one example of how the legacy of Reverend Lawson's work devoted to instructing people to engage in nonviolent direct action over the years has shaped American society and benefited the overwhelming majority of people today, irrespective of their ethnicity, gender, nationality, and the like. He taught the first wave of what I call the freedom fighters: John Lewis, Robert Parris Moses, Vincent Harding, Charlie Cobb, James Foreman, James Bevel, and others. who in turn organized, inspired white and black students, men and women, who became the field workers for the Freedom Summer, something else I was going to say here, and the seminal Selma campaigns of 1964 and 65, respectively. It is these field workers that are now armed with the practice and the philosophy and the strength and integrity to use direct, non-violent action to compel institutions to change, that resulted in the passage of several important laws, including the 64 Civil Rights Act, desegregating public accommodations, and the 1965 Voting Rights Act that enabled thousands to vote. Dr. Lawson remains an essential and inspiring figure who allied with Martin Luther King Jr., his dear friend, and others such as Kelly Miller Smith, Amzie Moore, Ralph Abernathy, and the late C.T. Vivian, who passed away a few months ago, too, this past year, in an effort to end racism and social injustice. He works now, as he did earlier, to abolish voter suppression and promotes campaigns to have genuine political democracy in his nation. Reverend Lawson has consistently fought against economic exploitation, championed the rights of labor, and seeks equality of opportunity for the poor, the weak, the oppressed, and the dispossessed. Dr. Lawson has not only been at the forefront of the civil rights movement for African Americans, but also for others who experienced the residual effects of the historic transgenerational legacy of slavery or genocide or rampant social hostility and bigotry, the savagery of epidemic police violence and brutality, and the killing of innocent people frequently documented again today in this country. It is meaningful to have Reverend Lawson here for this Black History Month program for several reasons. First, he is one of the few remaining leaders of the civil rights movement who knows firsthand how a measure of progress was made then, and even if it now seems somewhat ephemeral to a younger generation, perhaps he can identify and tell us the lessons that were learned, taught, and implemented in securing some of the achievements of that movement. Similarly, in comparing the 1950s and 60s with today, some valuable insights from the past can be adopted today. At least I hope so. And as we confront numerous problems, such as the grotesque and increasingly economic inequality between rich and poor, the rabid, unbridled racism, the growing intolerance and incivility, the apparent disregard for democratic practice and participation, the failure to make justice the foundation of law. When you think of the brutal murder of George Floyd and so many others, the bold resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan and right-wing conservative extremists that seem willing to use force and violence to assert their will, even if it means insurrection and toppling the very government itself. What are some of the lessons we can take from the past civil rights movement and apply to improving our world today? What new lessons or practices should we learn and employ in shaping our country and world for the better? After having heard your address at John Lewis's memorial service, I'm talking to about Reverend Lawson, I was just so moved by it because of all the people that came to that. His was the most cogently stated, the most meaningful, and I think had application for where we are today in this world. I believe we would all benefit in learning from you, Reverend Lawson, and hearing what you have to say. Thank you for coming.
You're very welcome. I'm pleased for the invitation to be with you this afternoon. I want to know how much time the Zoom conference has. Is it until 6 o'clock?
Well, I probably took too much time. Can we stay? Can we push it a little longer if necessary? Yeah, 6 o'clock will do. Yes,
All right, well, I don't want
if
to
you need
talk
it.
too long.
Okay.
Anyway, and also, um, um, I'm not sure that what I am going to say is going to make very much sense. Um, um, Black History Month was the effort of some of the early intellectuals and spiritual leaders of the early 20th century to indicate that the USA history has to be greatly um, expanded if the United States is to become a democratic society, which we are not, because democracy has to have in it equality, liberty, justice for all. And that has eluded us in so many ways. Um, so, voting rights, voting registration was among the very first pieces of strategy that the NAACP back in 1910, as it just got itself organized, supported. And voter registration was the way in which the NAACP said that uh, the Black people must participate fully and engage this society if this society is indeed to become just and fair for all of its people. Um, so, as a long history, I want to try to say that we can't learn all that history. It's far more than what we can learn. The past is the past, and very often we live in today's world with a part of that past in our very genes and DNA. And the important point for, I think, a university is that most of the students in a university are people who are shaping their sense of their being alive and who they are and what they are. And their age uh, between the years of 17 and 22 or 23 are some of the critical years for any human being uh, to struggle in order to be able to point their lives in the direction that will enable them to appreciate the gift of life and to learn to think and love and to learn to labor and struggle and to especially learn to care about fellow human beings. That in the scriptures that I've come from, that those scriptures call fellow human beings the neighbor with special responsibility for every human being. And what we have often seen in our country is the lack of recognizing the neighbor. And we have a great deal of lacking on the part of the power struggles, the power brokers, the nations of the earth today tend not to lift up the necessity of our being one human race, one human family, one people of one blood, of one gift of life, and with indeed an infinite possibility to allow human living to soar and to achieve in ways that we can never imagine, and that I have never imagined. So we come out of the past and we live it in our very bones. What we can gain from the past is to enough essential awareness of life that we don't make the mistakes of the past, that we cut short the injustices of the past that need to be cut short, and that we live our lives in a way that will allow a new level of living and consciousness to emerge in every capacity. So with that in mind, I'm going to say very quickly, Martin Luther King Jr. is perhaps the most important figure out of the 20th century. His statue was on the Mall because a rather significant movement encouraged Congress to write the bills that later were signed by different presidents and put his statue on the Mall and established the third Monday of January as Martin Luther King's Day. Those did not happen accidentally. I participated in both of those particular campaigns to put the statue on the Mall and to declare the um, birthday of Martin King a national holiday. And let me then very quickly try to suggest why. Martin Luther King was like many of the rest of us, growing up in a family in Atlanta, Georgia, and early on recognizing that his life meant something, though he didn't always know what it meant. But having and affording the possibility of going to school, graduating at high school, 14 or 15, going to Morehouse and graduating from Morehouse at 19, and then going to Chester, Pennsylvania, where he went to Rochester Theological School and got a degree from there, and moved rapidly on, and by the age of 23 had completed all his work for his PhD at Boston University, and wrote his thesis while a pastor in Montgomery, Alabama at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. In that brief journey of his, he came to recognize that his life was really had to be a life that committed itself to dealing with the issue that had always troubled him, namely segregation and Jim Crow law, and the fierce economic prohibitions and shackles that were put on Black people, not only from slavery, but out of slavery in the 20th century. And he met that challenge with the emergence by Black women of the Montgomery bus boycott. A group of leaders from Montgomery, Black leaders, business, fraternity, religious, educators, gathered and asked Martin King to become the advocate and spokesperson for the boycott. He had declined taking positions in the community in 1955, feeling he was too much the newcomer and that he was much too young. But for various reasons, he was surprised at being asked, and he agreed to do it. In his speech that evening in a mass meeting where there was standing room only in the Holt Street Baptist Church, with crowds outside, it took him an hour to get to the church, walking through the crowds because there were no parking spaces anywhere around. Martin King insisted that the boycott must go on, but he set a tone because he said, we're not going to carry on this bus boycott like the Ku Klux Klan. We're not going to go into the city of Montgomery and drag white people out into the streets and beat them fiercely. He said, we're not going to go in different places of Montgomery and put up a cross-looking board, branches of trees or just 2x4s, and burn them to intimidate, which is what went on in Black communities in Montgomery and elsewhere. He said, we're going to do this through Christian love. King had sufficient knowledge and wisdom to understand that you cannot fight evil with evil. You only multiply the evil. You cannot fight injustice with other forms of injustice. As the great scientist of the 20th century, Albert Einstein, said at one point, you can't fight a problem by being so immersed in the problem that you speak from the side of the problem. You've got to find a level of seeing the problem and addressing the problem so that you can begin to solve the problem. So King set the tone for the Montgomery bus boycott by insisting that there was a better way to work, a better way to do politics, a better way to challenge the evil laws and the evil treatments that Black people had received in Montgomery for more than 200 years. And so thus, a very specific dimension of struggle was born in an awesome way in the United States. That very specific form of struggle can be called soul force struggle or nonviolent struggle. And while nonviolence might have been new to many people in Montgomery in 55, 56, 57, it was not new in the world. While some people had not perhaps heard the term nonviolence, they did give Martin King an overwhelming enthusiastic response because he began to point a way for challenging the push in the United States to make the United States a racist, segregated society, and to do it in such a fashion that it would change the conscience of the nation. So I want you to understand that when the media uses the term civil rights movement, it helps to create a lot of confusion, because the civil rights movement is the historic political struggle in the United States that acknowledged that as this nation formed itself, only 7% of the folk of the first 13 colonies were allowed to vote for president. Only 7%. And they had to be male, and they had to own a piece of property. I mean, let's not pretend that human rights and civil rights were in the 13 colonies. And let's not pretend, therefore, that the current struggle going on to continue the restriction of voting and preventing of various peoples to vote is something new. It's a long time process in the United States. And the NAACP, with its push to register the vote, set the key to a part of the way in which we had to move. So the civil rights movement is the omnibus umbrella movement. But within that movement, there are at least 25 or 30 major campaigns. For example, the NAACP also established one of those major strategies when they decided they would train and help prepare lawyers, and they would grab hold of lawyers who would go to court and cause the Supreme Court to make decisions to deracialize the Constitution and to take out from underneath racism and Jim Crow law any legitimacy. Um, so, a major strategy of the early 20th century, therefore, was to use the court, a nonviolent vehicle, use the law to reverse and change injustice. So, and the use of the law as a way of nonviolent making changes in society is a time honored way of working. So we must not forget that picture. The Montgomery bus boycott, pushed largely by Black women, Mary Jo Robinson and Annie Carr and Rosa Parks and Louise West and a slew of women, um, became then a new strategy. That new strategy and con- resulted in 20 years of major nonviolent campaigns: the Freedom Ride, the Mississippi Summer of '64, the Albany Movement of 1962, the St. Augustine, Florida Movement of '64, the '63 Birmingham campaign. All of these campaigns pushed voter registration. But what was different was organizing people to move against the enemy by dramatizing our grievances through nonviolent public behavior. Hence the sit-in campaign of 1960 and many other dramatization of our grievances. Nonviolence allowed the nation to have a chance to observe and to see and to recognize that this Montgomery bus boycott was an opportunity for the nation to reach a new understanding of its ethical responsibilities and to begin the dismantling of the past that needed to be dismantled because it continued to exist in the 20th century, and give people and institutions and organizations an opportunity to reshape the society. And so hence I say the civil rights movement, large dimension. But then I say the nonviolent movement of America, a major engine for what happened to change our country forever, and for the present moment where the historical forces have personified themselves in the person of Donald Trump as the major symbol of resisting, moving from chaos to community. I quote here Martin Luther King Jr. So I want, therefore, in Black History Month for Cal State, LA, to insist that King is the figure around which we can best organize for social justice and to eradicate every vestige of injustice in our society. Let me suggest quickly that there are four historical injustices that influence more people in the United States than what we know, and influence in various ways all of us. I'm not putting these in some kind of priority, but I would say that those four historical forces are the ancient oppression of women, sexism, the domination of the male, political and social and economic and military structures dominated by the male, and uh, women being treated pretty terribly in various parts of the world in various ways. So, sexism, racism, exported as a part of Columbus coming to uh, North America in 1492, but also exported by Western civilization into the Congo and into South Africa, into India, into China, into the South Sea Islands. The third major historical force impacting most Americans is the force of violence because of the mythology across human history that violence is the power you use that has the greatest chance of bringing about change. Well, violence does bring about change, but very often in the home, it produces people then who use violence all their lives. The violence of language, the violence of the spirit, the violence of the mind, the violence of the hands and feet, and the violence of the gun. Um, Sexism, racism, violence. And then finally, what I call plantation capitalism, which has very little to do with Adam Smith's book on capitalism. But it is the form of capitalism that we live under and have lived under for literally 250 or more years. Plantation capitalism relishes wealth gathering as a way of identification of the person. It gathers also political power to dominate large numbers of people and to prevent those people from also achieving living wages and sustenance for their lives and for the future of their children and their grandchildren. Plantation capitalism demands that the society be hell bent with huge military forces for the purpose of domination, using violence as a major way to keep the economic advantage in place. So, as I have watched for 60 or 70 years, our country, from 1942 especially, we have demanded that Mexico and Latin America and Central America do what we tell them to do. We have never supported any government anywhere in the world that wants to be independent of the empire system. And I'm fairly angry with the China that follows Russia and the United States to be a dominant power rather than a power for truth and for a new world community. Martin King speaks of the world house. So I say very simply, quickly, and to end my own remarks, that nonviolent struggle is the major contribution of Dr. King. You can kill off the enemies, but you don't kill off sufficient to change the injustice. Nonviolence gives the enemy an opportunity to be seen as a human being and a chance to bring about change. None of you know what this country was like 1940, 1950, 1960, 1970, 1980. It is radically different. For an example, I'm just going to say very quickly, Pamela Scott Johnson, the dean. I traveled in high school to many college campuses for different functions in high school and then in college. those campuses had very few women professors on them. Almost no, almost no women administrators, deans, and the rest. This is in the late mid 40s and late 40s. When I lectured today at a Tufts University, the women are everywhere. They're in all sorts of positions. And the country has, the university level higher education has been transformed by women and by people of color, which in 1945 or 1960 was not the case. It is the nonviolent movement of America, and nonviolent movement of America is the way that the late Congressman John Lewis identified what we did. I put it in the years between 1953 and 1973. Major nonviolent campaigns covered by some of them moving to all 50 states in terms of support from all kinds of people, intergenerational in many instances.
Around 15, 16 months.
Big
It's
pardon?
been a while, and it does play in your mind. So it doesn't, when you go through a little bit of trauma like that.
I'm afraid I didn't quite hear.
I'm sorry, please put in your questions in chat and let Reverend Lawson finish his speech.
I've spoken only about 30 minutes, but I'm going to finish very quickly. The point I want to make is that Martin Luther King Jr. was the advocate and the strategist of the nonviolent movement of America. He and I worked together very closely. I supported him from December the 1st, 1955 to the day of his assassination, April 4th, where he and I were together for at least 4 to 6 hours on that day when he was assassinated, because we were working on the sanitation strike of Memphis at the time. The primary theme that Martin Luther King brings to us is one that nonviolent struggle, nonviolent methodology, nonviolent tactics, nonviolence campaigns are the only way that Western civilization can help move the earth to becoming what God would have the earth become, where there is access to the great gift of life to all 7 or 8 billion people, where the human institutions and political struggles end the assault of sexism, racism, violence, and plantation capitalism, and allow people all over the world to create a different destiny, a destiny that it can be filled with hope. Violence has not enriched or enabled the earth to reach the goals we yet need to reach. Black people, I think, need to be especially concerned because the United States has 6,000 troops in 43 countries in Africa. In at least 3 of those countries, our troops are engaged in chasing what we've called the terrorist guerrilla forces in those countries. So Africa is going to soon become like the Middle East in devastation. King insists, if the human race is to live and not die, if it's to flourish and not become increasingly impoverished, if it is to become an earth, a world where indeed there is access for every baby, boy or girl born, then the human family must leave behind the rapaciousness of violent language and emotions and fears, and use the great power of the universe, the power of creation, the power of love, the power of justice. So King should be remembered as the first world leader who, indeed, in the Western world, Gandhi, of course, can be called the father of nonviolence. King is the first significant leader that says to Western civilization, change or die. In the words of the poet T.S. Eliot, uh, commit suicide with a whimper or a bang. So I would push Cal State LA and everyone who's participating to understand that the nonviolent intervention that Gandhi made in 1906, 1920, 1930 represents a historic, monumental question. And I invite you to explore the possibilities of social justice and equality through nonviolent struggle.
Okay. Let us know when you're through, Reverend Lawson.
I'm through.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Thank you so much. What we want to do is get some questions. I don't know, Nene, do you have any questions for us? Let me ask one too before we do leave. And this, would you tell us about your institute and the courses that you teach and how someone can register for them just before you go?
Well, we're closing down. Is that it?
Well, we've got a half an hour left, a little less than about 25 minutes, 20 minutes left.
Well, you and I can talk about that over the phone. I would rather have.
Okay, and I can share it with the students. Okay, thank you. Just wanted info on that.
You're right, of course. I do have a James Lawson Institute, and we do work on Zoom to create conversation.
Okay, thank you again. So, Nene?
Yes, we have a question from Christopher Lovano. Please excuse my pronunciation. But how do African people feel about the concept of Pan-Africanism in the modern day? And I believe this was directed to
Dr. Tolan?
Dr. Tolan, yes.
Mhm.
Thank you, Nene, and thank you, Christopher, for the question. That's a very good question. I think, Pan-Africanism, it was kind of squashed by a lot of African governments in the post-colonial period. A lot of the people who were ardent Pan-Africanists were dissidents too, so they, usually often weren't supportive of the national governments in African countries because they were becoming increasingly repressive. So many of the people were jailed or exiled, ended up in the United States and Europe. And so, the movement kind of died out, I would say, in the 80s. Today, people are starting to talk about it again. But the relationship between North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa was really became more tense, in the 70s and 80s as people started talking about the trans-Saharan slave trade a lot more. We had talked about the transatlantic slave trade for decades at that point, but the trans-Saharan slave trade is still being explored now, and the history is still, we don't have that many slave narratives, and it's still kind of, being debated and amongst historians now. So I think that as that history came up, more and more people from Sub-Saharan Africa were like, wait, we don't want to create any kind of, fellowship with you. You enslaved our forefathers. So it's a complicated, it's a complicated question. And there are certainly Pan-Africanist movements in Africa today, but there's also, in some ways a larger split between North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa that there was, I think, in the 60s and 70s. I hope that helps answer.
Thank you, Dr. Tolan. So our next question is from Dean Scott Johnson, and she says, how will we be able to promote nonviolence when it's being fueled by the funds of capitalism and from the highest in the land? We now have members of Congress now say that the violence at the Capitol was free expression. And Reverend Lawson, please feel free to jump in as well.
I'm not sure I understand the question very well.
So she says, how will we be able to promote nonviolence when it's been fueled by the funds of capitalism, especially from the highest in the land?
Well, I think the question is not clear. After all, the United States is fueled by the funds of capitalism. and yet, you know, we have advanced a far cry from what things were in the 1950s or 60s, and we've self-financed. I made no salaries except what I earned as a pastor in a local congregation. Um, so we're fairly poor, but we're able to do the work. I think that to do justice, you work locally. You cannot work on a regional or international basis without the resources and the building of staff. But you can locally take a look at where you're living and who are the people, what the issues are. And we did this very often in the 60s, and I'm doing much of it nowadays with labor unions. So it can be done. Los Angeles is now a labor city. Since the 1980s, we have seen labor unions grow to over 800,000 members in Los Angeles, and a magnificent group growing in Orange County and in Arizona. And this is through local organizing and through also nonviolent philosophy and understanding and tactics. So it does work. That's the point I would make. There's enough experiment with it that I can demonstrate place after place where it worked beautifully. So it's not a question of how it's funded. Capitalism funds most of everything in the world today, including what goes on in China. And the issue is not against capitalism. The issue is against the economic impoverishment of people. When the world is resourceful enough to supply human need across the earth. But it is, as Gandhi said, it is not resourceful enough to supply greed and militarism.
Thank you, Reverend Lawson. And this question again is for you from Joel Navia, who says, was there any major opposition to the MLK holiday?
To the MLK what?
Holiday, to the holiday.
Oh, I'm sure there was. When King died, he was the most hated man in America. I had white people call me and tell me how glad they were that King had been assassinated and that he was assassinated in Memphis. Of course, he was the most hated man at the time. I mean, the whole picture of civil rights in the United States, I think, is not that accurate in many ways. It covers up a lot of stuff. And a part of my own purpose, having worked in it from 1958 especially, is to try to make things a little bit more clear. I use the term plantation capitalism to historically describe how the Western world moved across the face of the earth on a quest of what they call, some people, his discovery, but it was a quest of conquest. It was a quest for wealth. And that distorted the church. So I think in the United States, I think that, well, I resist the business about global this and global that. I think global is not a good way to describe the human race around the world. It's not a good way to describe the beautiful planet Earth. Oh, how mysterious and yet wonderful life is. I think it is a way of framing things to keep the status quo. And I think the status quo is part of the problem.
So since you talked about global, I see a question in here for both you and Dr. Tolan in regards to that. So the question is, do you think, and this is from Dr. Camille Suarez, do you think one thing we should learn from Dr. King and the global freedom fighters you shared, should civil rights movement and freedom struggles be concerned with the global as much as the local?
The global what?
Should the civil rights movements and freedom struggles be concerned with the global as much as the local?
I say the enemies of the human race want you to be concerned with the global, where you do not have the power to do very much, most of us. At the local level, you do have great power if you join with a handful of people, or join with a handful of people to analyze your situation locally. You do have great power to create a model that other people can adopt and bring about change. I think the whole global push is a mechanistic push for the purpose of our uh, not recognizing our humanity and the fact that the gift of life gives us power. And that power is not the power to do wrong, but the power to do right. And we've seen in recent years in the United States more than ever before a political process, an economic process that does wrong.
Dr. Tolan, did you have something to add?
Oh, there.
Sure. I mean, I think, I do think that there's so much power in local organization, but I also think that we can't really think of any problem. Our world today is so tied together. You can't think about the problem of labor in the United States without thinking about people in China and Bangladesh, making the tennis shoes that we all wear. I think it's impossible to completely, divorce ourselves from the poor of the world, the working class of the world. And so, and there are individuals who, like Dr. King and yourself, you traveled to India, Dr. Reverend Lawson. I mean, there are so many people who are tied to networks and people, individuals across the world.
Okay, but Dr. Tolan, my thesis is, and I've, in the 1950s, 60s, I stopped taking world journeys, except for on vacation a couple times, because I maintain that the USA empire is gargantua, and that unless we can change the USA empire, no people anywhere will be safe in their pursuit of developing the beloved community.
And with that, I agree, for sure.
So my contention is that for USA people, the primary task is to change United States. United States has 800 military bases in more than 100 countries. They are not there to spread democracy. They are there to protect the shipping of gold, the shipping of oil, the shipping of dollars, the shipping of diamonds, the shipping of cobalt, and a great variety of other minerals that we want for the technological revolution. So it's my contention that if you're concerned for justice in Northeast Congo, then your concern ought to be to change the United States of America. Our foreign policy is atrocious. We participated in the murder of an elected president of Chile. We participated in the murder of Lumumba of the Congo, we betrayed the whereabouts of Nelson Mandela, so he went to prison for 27 years. We did not support Gandhi and Nehru in the emergence of what was called back then the largest democracy in the world. The United States insists that the earth belongs to us and that all people everywhere must do as we command. So if we're concerned for our sisters and brothers in the world, we have to change the United States.
Thank you.
Thank you. This question is from Jeffrey Hall, and he says, "Thanks for the presentations. Got a question. If I'm not wrong, one of Abraham Lincoln's ideals was to take African American individuals back to Africa, even though it is said he had good intentions to reunite Black individuals with their culture. Would you consider this as a racist action?"
Well, I'm not prepared to really judge those kinds of opinions. The first resistance to slavery in the United States and my forebears, my great-great-grandparents were slaves on the East Coast. The first resistance to slavery was the Negro spiritual, in which Negroes, according to Frederick Douglass, slaves were forced to sing on the plantation so that the master's family would know where the slaves were on the plantation. So they produced this tremendous library of music called the Negro Spiritual. And the Negro Spiritual called for people to identify themselves as children of God. And so it's that spirit that caused many slaves to escape into Mexico, into the swamps of Florida. In my own case, my own family escaped up through Philadelphia on the Underground Railroad into Canada. So the first defense against slavery was the identification of selfhood and life, and then slaves running away, slaves escaping. I honor that history. I think it's a very important history, whether I agree with it or not. But the point I would make is that resistance takes many different forms. And I am against much of the theoretical stuff that I've heard across my life in the United States, because I think much of it is a kind of a white analysis of the social scene and the political scene. And it misses, it did not predict what we did in the mid-60s. It did not think we could make changes that we helped to make. And of course, some Black folk, some Black academics think not enough changes have. Of course it hasn't. Of course enough change has not yet happened, because every generation must pick up the cudgels. But BLM has put into the picture the largest nonviolent campaign the United States have ever had. From May of last year to August, more than 8,000 demonstrations in every state, in more than 2,500 locations, involving perhaps 15 to 25 million people, and putting on the agenda of America that racial violence must stop, especially now as it expresses itself through law enforcement. That's the first time the United States has ever had any notion that a democracy did not have to have a gun for enforcement. The BLM campaign is an evolutionary campaign and it's a socially organic process, and it's an incredible thing. And the violence that the media talks about is mostly the violence of the anarchists, the Antifa and the looters, and most of all, it's mostly the violence of the police that represent the violent culture. We are the most violent culture in the world. We are, King's words in the April 4th, 1967 speech was that we are the #1 purveyor of violence in the world.
Yes, that's what I was looking for to recall.
That's
Yeah.
why we have been at war every century except about 22 years, 24 years. The United States government has been at war protecting its economic wealth and advances.
Thank you, Reverend Lawson. So this question came in privately to me, and it says, if the US were not a dominant force in the world, wouldn't the world be worse off if China or Russia became the dominant power? These are countries that are overtly prone to abuse human, let alone civil rights.
Well, no one is more the abuser of human rights than the United States of America. We vanquished 11 to 15 million people who were the Indian people of the United States. We decimated them. There may be no more than 2 or 3 million now across the 50 states. No one has been more violent than we have been. Our Supreme Court has never upheld human rights for all the citizens of the United States until this NAACP got the first big decision May 17th, 1954. For over 200 years, the Supreme Court never acknowledged that women or Black people had fundamental human rights to be recognized in the United States. So we talk over the Supreme Court as though it was some great body. No, it was a body for slavery. It said we can have a beautiful Declaration of Independence and a beautiful Constitution, but we can still have slavery, and we can still help the formation of millionaires and billionaires in the world. So that's a part of the history that I have in my own bones, which compels me to be engaged in struggle for change.
I see we're running out of time. So one last question. Reverend Lawson, can you share anything special about your relationship with Martin Luther King Jr. that the general public doesn't know? For example, is there a hobby you both enjoy together to blow off steam?
We were the same age. I was born 5 months before him. We had some of the same perspectives on the Christian faith that we enjoyed. We were not dogmatic Christians with all kinds of belief systems. For us, religion is a passion to live life fully and to live it seeking the well-being of our neighbor. We both loved to sing. We loved to eat. We played basketball and baseball, um, touch football when we were in our summer training sessions and summer staff meetings. And we took long walks in Penn Center and a couple other centers, camp sites, to talk over the situation. People are not aware that in the last year of his life, Martin King and I and one or two others were talking about declaring a moratorium on demonstrations so that after the Poor People's Campaign, we would find some space to restructure our campaigns. I was one of his advisors on Vietnam. I urged him not to speak out on Vietnam, American foreign policy, in 1960, 61, 62, 63, 64. We talked about these matters. It is not true that SNCC reached a position against the Vietnam war before Martin King, we always had great struggles. I was always opposed to the war machinery of the United States from my early youth. I did not go to jail as a conscientious objector. I went to a jail because I said the Draft Act is an unjust act. And so I will not cooperate with being drafted into the armed forces. That was my position. I could have not gone because I was a student and because I also was a pre-ministerial student and because I could have been a conscientious objector. I said the draft young men to go to war in Vietnam and elsewhere around the world was irrational and unfair. And so I would not carry draft cards. I sent draft cards back to the local draft board. And consequently, when the Korean War happened, now I know some of the books say, well, the Korean War happened, he refused. That's nonsense. I sent my draft cards back in around 1948 and refused to carry draft cards. You had to register to 18 and you had to carry the card everywhere you went to show that you were registered. So in any case, uh, uh, um, my understanding of nonviolent struggle is still what I push on you most, and as most meaningful about Martin Luther King Jr. He was a world leader who insisted the human race must move to the greatest force in the universe, the gift of life. And that gift of life could only be understood and appreciated in terms of love and compassion and truth. And that if the human race did not move in that direction, led by the United States, we would commit suicide. And I sort of lay that before every college group that I work with. You have a choice. We must give up our um, drunkenness in relationship to violence and recognize we've been given the greater gift of power, love, truth, life itself. And that's the most creative power. And when we learn, as Gandhi said, how to use that life, we will be surprised at what kind of city and nation and earth we will be able to create.
Well, thank you very, very much, Reverend Lawson, for coming and joining us. It's been a treat for all of us. And I'll be talking with you again soon. Nene, was there anything else? Is that it? Yeah, you've been very generous with your time, and it is very much appreciated from all of us.
My pleasure.
Yeah.
Pleased
You
to
go
be-
safely too. Go safe. Have you had your COVID shots yet?
Yes, I just got my second shot today.
Okay. Well, I
Good
join
night.
you. That was my issue too, coming in. I just got mine today too.
Got my second shot. So
Okay.
Good night, and thank
Well,
you so
bless
much
you. Thank
for
you.
being with
And
us.
I thank the rest of you also.
Absolutely.
Joy, we'll talk
Thank
tomorrow, the dean. Yes, thank you. Thank you. Dr. Tolan, we'll talk again.
Dr. Cohen.
Thank you, Dr. Yuki. Thank you.
I enjoyed your paper. Oh, he's gone now, but I was going to say, I was going to eat up the time. I'd rather hear from the students. But I think we mentioned before, he knows Charlie Kopp. He was with the SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And consistent with what you were saying, there were Black civil rights people here who went to Africa, not just you mentioned Cleaver, of course, and the saxophone players from LA. And who else? But some of the sick people were rashly treated just because of the color of their skin. They were pushed back to the back of the line if they were lined up at the market, open air market, to get things. Oh, you can't stand here. You got to go to the back. And that was quite an awakening for some of the guys that had often romanticized Africa in a way. I was going to say too, you mentioned that maybe Pan-African studies isn't, or not African studies, but Pan-Africanism isn't strong today, but you must know this, that in the early days of independence, Nnamdi Azikiwe, he went to Lincoln, the black school outside of Philadelphia, your alma mater. Kwame Nkrumah came here often and offered asylum, not only for Du Bois, but Robeson as well. It's a mixed role. And maybe your students don't know this, but that idea of Pan-Africanism doesn't have its origins in Africa. It comes out of the West Indies, really, and other figures in the United States back into the actually the 19th century, the early examples of that, you know. But we can talk more about that.
Yeah.
Barry Bitker, it's good to see you, man. And oh yeah, Afshin too. I can't hear you, Barry.
Can you hear me now?
Oh yes.
Okay. This
Joy
is
is here too.
my first Zoom conference. I really
I think
don't.
it was mine too.
I'm kind of a Luddite. Yeah, a couple of things that I hope could be addressed. One thing that kept popping to my mind as Dr. Lawson was talking was the Moral Mondays and the Poor People's Campaign that Dr. Reverend Barber
Yes,
doing.
in North Carolina. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, in North Carolina. Yeah.
Yeah.
Barbara, sure.
I mean, he's sort of been trying to make that into a national campaign. I don't know what effect that it will have, but one of the terms that keeps popping up in all kinds of discussions, the press and everything these days is equality or inequality, right? And I think it baffles me. It has my entire life why it is that poor whites are working against their own interest through racism. And then when we see what's going on today, internationally in Europe, the white nationalist movements that are emerging in Europe and what happened on January 6th and all that kind of stuff. I'm kind of baffled. I don't know how to overcome that.
Yeah. Well, it runs deep. It runs deep to the very core, going all the way back to colonial America, really. Yeah, that's going to take a little more discussion than we can do now. Maybe one day we can have you come and do a Zoom, have a Zoom presentation.
When this COVID thing gets behind us, maybe we can start thinking about bringing back some of the teach-ins that happened when you and I were much younger around the Vietnam War. But why not have a teach-in these days about the rise of fascism? And frankly, that's what we saw on January 6th. We saw the rise of fascism in our country. We've been seeing it develop in Europe for a long time. The Alternative for Germany, Marine Le Pen, all of the anti-refugee stuff that's been going on there. I think democracy is truly in danger, and we need to find out how to build a movement to defend democracy.
Well, Barry, good
Yes.
to see you after many years. I don't know if you remember me.
Yes, I do.
I just want to say the history department has been holding a series of teach-ins on current politics. And so we'll make sure you're on our mailing list. And I also want to thank Dr. Yeki for organizing this fantastic panel and for Dr. Tolan for giving a wonderful talk. And of course, Reverend Lawson has left. So thank you guys.
Okay.
And Mayday.
It's good to see you, both of you.
And
Barry, for the rest of you, Barry is a former undergraduate, he went to, got his
I was a graduate student. I did my
graduate student. That's
undergraduate back in the 60s. And then about 30 years later, I decided to go to graduate school.
He's one of our best students. I don't want to give away Mr. Chaudhry's. He hails from India, but Mr. Chaudhry is also has some youth on his side.
I have some
Can understand.
questions, but I did not put it here because I did not want to take the time of anyone. But we will discuss in the class. I still have some questions which are very deep in the sense because I see the people who have power or wealth or whatever, none of them will be ready to give up even the small part of that voluntarily. So what are the other ways to get them, convince them at least, okay, your long-term interest is to cooperate with the non-violent or peaceful movements?
I see. Well, listen,
Because
I'm glad all of
he
you've
was
come.
killed.
Yeah.
Martin Luther King, he was killed by the people who were very prejudiced and they did not like their ideas just for the sake of killing. If they were not killed, it would not have anyway hurt them. But still, you see, this grudge is so strong, they are ready just to kill someone.
Well, thank you for that. Listen, guys, you guys can stay. I've got to get to another class. I'm about 10
I
minutes
know,
late.
we will
Don't
talk in
tell
the
the chair of
class.
the department.
All
Please
right,
don't
thank
tell-
you.
let the
This,
chair-
this was good, Lamont. Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, yeah, I'll get in touch with you again, Barry. It's been too
All right.
long. And Dr. Tolan's remarks are really superb. I really enjoyed them.
Thank-
Nene, you were very helpful. I really thank you. And
Thank you, Nene.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
yeah, thank you.
It
Thank
was
you.
great. Thank you
Christopher,
all.
it's good to see you.
Thank you all
Are you
of
a history
them.
major,
We
Chris?
really enjoyed it and we learned a lot of things and it gave us some new ideas to think about them.
Sure, sure. Well, I'll be talking about some of these things too.
Sure.
I think if I mean to correct the good Reverend, because I have nothing but deep admiration and respect for him. Maybe you could tell, but his comment to put Antifa in that same bag, I don't know.
Yes,
It didn't catch
I
me
noticed that.
clearly. I wouldn't have put them in
I
this. Only
noticed
the
that.
fact that they're willing to use violence in that sense, yes. But
That's
they're
good.
but they're using. And I'm going to ask you this at some point, Choi, or maybe Dr. Tolan knows it. My reading of Gandhi is a little behind the times. Or maybe you, Akhtar, you from India.
Yes,
But the thing is,
at least
some-
I have studied about him and I know his background completely.
but in some of his early
And I know
writings, he didn't
in
rule
that
out
movement,
the
what
choice of
happened
violence.
after that movement?
He didn't rule out. And Martin Luther King, by the way, when they bombed his
Yeah.
house, he even got a gun. That's one of the things that the local authorities in Montgomery would make. But then he thought about it. He first started, he's very pragmatic. That's why you don't want to use violence. But then I think he became a way of life for him later. But listen, guys, I've got to go. So thank you for coming.
Thank you.
John, are you in the next class?
Bye, everybody.
Okay, bye, everybody. Thanks so much, Choi. Thank you,
Bye.
Nene. Barry,
you.
I'll talk with you later. And thank you,
Thank you,
Paraska.
Professor.
Thank you, Yaki.
Pardon? Okay, thank you so much, guys.
Thank you all.
Okay.